Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Richard Fontaine. He is the CEO of CNAS, which is the Center for New American Security. He's a dapper chap, has written for us in the past. He'll write for us again. If not, we will bully him to do so. And now we are going to get cracking on a discussion about national security, US national security. And what better time than now, because President Joe Biden is in Israel right now. Gaza is up in flames after a historic terrorist attack. And Richard, how does all of this affect the US?
Well, thanks for having me. I haven't been called a dapper chap ever in my life. So
there's a start. There's a first time for everything.
Yeah, so that's if you live long enough, anything is possible. Well, clearly, the news of the day is this major military operation that is underway in Gaza after this horrifying terrorist attack that Hamas launched in Israel. I think death toll as of this recording is somewhere north of 1,400 Israeli citizens, others injured, and obviously a nation really shaken and disturbed by what happened, and for very good reason. I mean, real echoes of 9/11.
200 kidnapped as well, nearly 200. They said 199.
Exactly.
So
yes,
that is the other terrible thing.
Including Americans. The President Biden is there now. He is quite vocal in his support for Israel and some of the steps that Israel is taking to defend himself and to go after Hamas. That is likely to bring about some opprobrium from the Arab world. We already saw today he was supposed to meet with the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, and Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. They canceled after a report that a hospital in Gaza was blown up. Their initial reporting suggested it was an Israeli rocket. It sounds now like it wasn't, but they canceled on him nevertheless. And this is before even the ground operation has begun. And so the United States has been trying to broker a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement and some other things in the Middle East. And this is going to make all of that more complicated.
So Israel is fundamental to U.S. security in the Middle East, and Israel being at war with Hamas jeopardizes not just Israel, but the region as a whole.
Potentially. Hopefully not.
Mm-hmm.
But right now there's a U.S. aircraft carrier task force that is right off the coast. There's another one steaming its way over. There's a Marine Expeditionary Unit off the coast. And so U.S. military power is surging to this region. The major reason it's surging to this region is to keep Hezbollah out of the fight, to deter Hezbollah from entering the fight. Because short-term nightmare is that while Israel's tied up in operations against Hamas in the south, Hezbollah, which has got much more military capability than Hamas does, in the north on the Lebanese border, decides now's the time to get into the fight. And then you've got a two-front war. And I think what the administration is trying to do is surge military power there and say, well, don't do it, because you could quite easily have a fight not only with the Israelis but with the Americans on your hands. You don't want that, so stay out of it. And yet, the region is on edge because of this. And so, to keep this contained is one of the top goals, I think, of the administration right now.
Yeah. On that note, to keep it contained being the top goals of the administration, the worrying fact, and by the way, Ambassador Gary Grappo, who retired as the head of the Office of the Peace Quartet in Jerusalem, was there with us. He has a full video, and we talked about this with him, but I'd love to get your view. The entire Arab Street from Morocco to Jordan has erupted. You see videos from Al-Aqsa, you see videos from the streets, you see videos from all over the Muslim world, actually, wherein people are talking about the Palestinian cause. Could this lead to an Arab uprisings too?
I doubt it. I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring, it was not vocal and organized around support for the Palestinians, but rather deep-rooted grievances at the governance or lack thereof in the countries, starting in Tunisia and sort of spreading outwards.
Inflation actually triggered it.
Yeah, so the standard of living, the economic, that's what I mean, the economic, especially the economic situation and the sort of sclerotic nature, particularly of the so-called Arab republics.
But that hasn't changed yet. So this could be a trigger that could, cause conflagration. Or do you think the ability of the governments to navigate popular unrest is better now?
No, I think the fact that it's focused on the Palestinians rather than the governments that are running these countries makes the governments feel more secure rather than less secure. I mean, the Palestinian cause has often been invoked as a way in Arab countries to focus resentment or anger away from the fact that many of these countries are very poorly governed with not great economic prospects, little political freedom, and so forth.
I see. So, on the whole, you expect that U.S. national interests won't be greatly affected and the situation will be under control?
No, I would not say. I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, it's the Middle East, and so one of the cardinal rules of the Middle East is no matter how bad things look, they can always get worse. And
Jake Sullivan forgot that.
Well,
he made an unfortunately timed comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was talking about sort of the broader picture in terms of normalization and all that. But yes, I mean, you can never count on things to be calm in the Middle East, even if they might be boiling under the surface and waiting for some sort of spark. So no, you can't be categorical about these things. But I think that the effort now is focused on, again, trying to keep this conflict contained. And as I look around the region, there's not a lot of countries that seem like they would want to get into a fight. I mean, if you went back enough decades.
It's not 1973.
That's the point.
Yeah, it's not the Yom Kippur
War.
Right,
so the government of Jordan doesn't want to attack Israel. The government of Egypt doesn't want to. And no Arab government wants to attack
not even
Israel,
Syria,
with the possible exception of the Lebanese with Hezbollah. And the Iranians don't appear to want to attack Israel directly. They're happy to fight Israel to the last Arab, but not necessarily to the last Iranian. And so what they seem eager to do is to whip up proxies, of which they've got a number, to pressure or attack Israel rather than do it themselves. So, I mean, it's a cynical kind of way of proceeding, but it may end up at least taking the prospect of interstate war off the table.
Well, you've talked about interstate war, and there is an interstate war on between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
Does the conflagration in the Middle East give Vladimir Putin an advantage?
It cuts a couple different ways. I mean, in one way, sure, I'm sure Putin is glad that there's something that is occupying the focus of the United States and Europe other than Ukraine right now. There's some limited amount of military resources that will end up going to Israel, maybe that could have been used elsewhere. But I don't know how much solace that's going to be. And I'll give you a counterexample. So the administration really wanted an additional aid package for Ukraine. It was unclear whether they were going to be able to get that through the House of Representatives. To count on the House of Representatives right now to do anything is a stretch. We don't even have a Speaker of the House. Nevertheless, the fact that Israel aid, which is widely supported in both the House and the Senate, is very likely to move. Packaging the Ukraine aid with the Israel aid is going to make it likelier that Ukraine gets military aid than before the war in Israel, which is good for Ukraine and bad for Putin. So, I think the real area where Russia and China as well would like to sort of make some metaphorical money is in what people started calling the global South again, and showing the United States as being, knee-jerk supporters of Israel no matter what, and indifferent toward the status of the Palestinians and all of that, and try to use that to undermine support for the United States and its positions. But I don't know that any of that's going to change the situation on the ground in Ukraine.
So, what is your read of the situation on the ground in Ukraine? Because there are two countervailing points of view. One point of view is that Ukraine is eventually going to wear Russia out. The other point of view is that Ukrainian economy cratered by 30% last year. It is barely growing. Russian economy has fared much better. Russia has more men, more material. And in this battle of attrition, Russia has the better hand.
Yeah, I think a very long war probably favors Russia for the reasons that you described, because Ukraine, in order to keep up a war of attrition, has to rely on the generosity of donor countries, primarily Europe and the United States, and the appetite to provide assistance is not as high today as it was at the beginning of this war, and presumably it will decline further over time. And Ukraine's manpower and so forth are limited in ways that Russia's is not. And Russia doesn't have those kind of constraints. It has, of course, other constraints, namely the fact that most of the folks who are fighting in the field don't really seem like they want to be there, and they have not been terribly effective. What this is sort of netted out to for the past, really most of this year, is not quite a stalemate, but something relatively close to a stalemate. I mean, the Russians earlier this year tried an offensive to push the Ukrainians back from their positions in the east. That didn't get very far. The Ukrainians tried a counteroffensive, which made some progress, limited progress in certain areas, but it was really tough with minefields and entrenched positions and all of this. And so you've got both sides continuing to fight quite vigorously, but not a lot of movement in terms of territory seized or given up, and certainly no movement toward an end game at the diplomatic table or anything else.
Do you think there will be diplomatic efforts in the months ahead, particularly after the winter?
No, probably not. I think we still got a lot of fighting to go. So, if we're doing this podcast again a year from now, my guess is that there'll still be a war between Ukraine and Russia.
So then, by your own analysis, as the war goes on, Russia will increasingly have the upper hand.
Generally speaking, yes, because of its resource base and things like that. But there's a bunch of unknowns. I mean, some of the new capabilities the United States has provided ATACMS to Ukraine, the HIMARS that the United States provided to Ukraine, a year or so ago, actually turned out to make quite a big difference. Who knows whether some new capabilities will make a difference for the Ukrainians? There's just a bunch of unknowns. So my guess is that there's fighting going on a year from now, but there could be a collapse of the Russian line somewhere. There could be, God forbid, a collapse on the Ukrainian side at some point. There's just a bunch of unknowns. The one sort of solid bet thus far has been, bet on a long war with no meaningful diplomatic energies expended to try to end it, because there's really no trade space between Ukraine and Russia. And therefore, you have a lot more fighting with continued support on Ukraine's side from the United States and Europe, and Russian support from Iran and North Korea, and indirectly from China, I guess. Yeah. So.
Just a quick question for you. Are you concerned about the growing friction between Ukraine and its neighbors, such as Poland and Hungary?
I'm not too concerned. I mean, Poland just had elections, so you're going to have a different government there anyway.
That's true. But the Hungarian president just met Vladimir Putin.
That's right. So I was going to say, I think we should distinguish between Poland and Hungary.
Yeah.
I think you should distinguish between Poland and Hungary even before these most recent elections. I mean,
one was under the Soviet thumb and suffered enormously, and before that under the Russian thumb. The other was under the Soviet thumb, and of course suffered in 1956 tremendously when the Soviets crushed the uprising in Budapest, but it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So very different memories in both countries.
All kinds of differences, including a different sort of character to the most recent governments in both of these places. Now, Poland's government will change over after these new elections to one that's more, pro-Europe and all of that. So I think any kind of tension with Ukraine is likely to subside there. Hungary is kind of the obvious outlier, and the meeting between the Hungarian leader and the Russian leader, I believe, marks the first time that there's been, a NATO leader meet with Putin since the war broke out.
That's correct.
And so, and it wasn't sort of a Macron fly in and try to, end the war sort of gambit. It seemed more like a, come in from the cold sort of thing, or some sort of solidarity kind of move. So yes,
does that worry you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think I think it would be much better if Hungary were a fully constructive member of NATO and of Europe and of the transatlantic relationship, and not, sort of throw bones to Vladimir Putin. But at the end of the day, I don't know how consequential that's going to be. I mean, that's not going to save Putin in Ukraine for sure.
I see. There's another problematic member of NATO, Turkey.
Yeah.
What do you think Turkey's role is going to be?
Turkey's role is always complicated. I just, a couple of weeks ago, saw President Erdogan in New York during the UN General Assembly. And
you met the Sultan?
Well, there were a few of us who met him, but
did you get invited to Istanbul, to his 1,000-room palace, Aksaray?
No, I'm still waiting for that invitation. But Turkey has had a complicated approach basically since the war in Ukraine broke out. I guess I would describe it as multi-aligned. I mean, it's certainly in a way formally aligned with the West and with NATO. I mean, it remains an alliance member and all of that. And yet, has occupied this space that, because of its ties to Russia, that has allowed it to do things like negotiate the original Black Grain Initiative or mediate the original Black Sea Grain Initiative, invoking the Montreux Convention so that warships couldn't pass through the Bosphorus on the way to the Black Sea and things like that. And so it's this kind of a middle position, I think, that the Turks have sort of scoped out, where they're sort of disproportionately important on some of these issues compared to another NATO member or something like that. And I think that's probably likely to be the role that they pursue.
Well, there is another tiny little matter over which Turkey has collaborated with Russia, and that is in Azerbaijan. In Nagorno-Karabakh, all the Armenians have been kicked out. Mm-hmm. It is a form of ethnic cleansing.
Yep.
And that happened with Russia's blessings, and that obviously happened with Turkey's involvement. In fact, Erdogan was present in the Azerbaijani capital to announce victory.
Yep. And that may not be the end of the game, because the Azeris look like they're poised to potentially invade Armenia and try to take the southern portion of that country, so as to build essentially a land bridge across what is southern Armenia.
There is, to be fair, an Azeri enclave within Armenia called Nakhchivan, just as there was an Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan.
Correct, but that enclave is not connected to Azerbaijan.
Yes.
You would have to go through what is Armenian territory.
Exactly, and that's what they are planning to do.
Right, so, but that's taking someone's territory, right? That is Armenian territory. So you have this potential seizure of territory by force on top of the ethnic cleansing that's happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's a pretty bad situation. It does show a bit of the I guess, I don't know, realignment's probably too strong, but I think Armenians thought for quite a while that Russia wouldn't let something like this happen, and it did. And it didn't do anything about it, or it couldn't do anything about it, and the Armenians were on their own.
But the Armenians bet on the U.S. They had this fond hope when I spoke to them that the U.S. would ride to its rescue.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by ride to their rescue. But if they meant, troops on the ground fighting off enemy invaders, then we haven't done that for Ukraine or other non-allied governments. So, unless and until these countries are members of NATO or allied with us in some other way, I am afraid that that's just a hope rather than a realistic expectation. I mean, the other thing on the Turkey side that we should mention is blocking the Swedish accession in NATO, which continues to be a source of great frustration. I mean, the Swedes should be in NATO yesterday and would bring...
At least they let the Finns in.
They let the Finns in, and this is turning on what the Turks believe is insufficient crackdowns of Sweden against Kurdish activists. The Swedes tend to refer to this as freedom of speech and other things, and freedom of assembly. But I really do hope that the Turks will see the bigger picture here and relax their blocking of Sweden, because Sweden would be a great ally to have in the alliance.
But Erdogan looks for a quid pro quo,
Yeah,
as a Swedish friend said off the record, a military man. Erdogan haggles like a carpet trader in a bazaar.
Well, he wants to get something,
Yeah.
and I think the Swedes have tried to accommodate the concerns of the Turks, but they have constitutional and other restrictions from going too much further. And I hope that the Turkish leadership at some point can say, okay, we've got what we've got, and ultimately this is a net increase in capability and power and so forth for the alliance, and therefore let's let this happen.
Will the U.S. have to bribe Turkey with F-16s and other goodies?
Well, I don't know. I don't think bribing Turkey is the way to put it with the F-16s. I mean, the Turks wanted F-35s, and they decided to buy S-400 missile defense or air defenses rather, from Russia, and the U.S. said no dice. You could pick one or the other, but not both. And so now F-16s has been the fallback. I think F-16s is probably possible, but certainly, going along with that kind of thing is, the clear desire among the Americans to, see the Turks lift their blocking of Swedish accession.
I see. So we should expect some quid pro quo then.
Well, maybe on the American side. I mean, certainly if we're going to engage in, this kind of give and take.
So much so for NATO and Turkey and Russia. Let's discuss what Glenn Carl, my co-author, calls the most consequential challenge to the US ever, which is the rise of China and the rise of an aggressive China under Emperor Xi Jinping. Now, my listeners will not forgive me for this. I was sitting with Richard Gere, and I left Richard Gere midway to come and fulfill my appointment with Richard Fontaine. So clearly you can see who's the biggest star in Washington, D.C.
So many Richards.
Anyway, so I've read on your website that the rise of China is a major concern. Now the US has 2 nuclear-armed adversaries. It's never had that before, and China is an economic power too. So what is your read on increasing tension over Taiwan and over the South China Sea?
They're both, certainly, I think US-China relations in general are going to continue to be tense indefinitely. That can be fine to some degree, depending on what issues you're talking about. I mean, we just have fundamentally different approaches to some key things. I mean, China wants to be the dominant military power in Asia, not the United States. The United States wants to be the dominant military power in Asia, not China. China wants to see a world safe for its brand of autocracy. The United States prefers to see the world safe for democracy. China wants to militarize the South China Sea and claim it for its own. The United States doesn't want China to do that. And you can go on and on.
Oh, the U.S. Is doing freedom of navigation operations for a while now to keep the sea lanes open there.
Right, which is something China doesn't want, right? So you can go on and on. And those are fundamental differences. The Taiwan issue is special because that, is the one issue that I think could lead to conflict. I think it's extremely unlikely that the United States and China are going to come to military blows over the South China Sea or the Uyghurs or pick whatever other issue that divides us. Taiwan, they could. And how do we know that? Well, because Xi Jinping has told his military to be ready for the forcible seizure of Taiwan by 2027. Doesn't mean he will, but he said be ready to be able to do it. And President Joe Biden 4 times publicly has said that if Taiwan is attacked, the United States will come to its defense. Well, maybe there's some wiggle room, but that's pretty categorical. So
the wiggle room is decreasing, though.
Right. So I think the Chinese believe the United States would defend Taiwan. I think, I can't speak obviously for the President of the United States or for this President of the United States or anything, but I think he's made pretty clear kind of how he sees things.
No, but you're an analyst, so you have a good read on the situation, in particular about American policy.
Right, and I think the willingness to defend Taiwan, for example, which is not allied to the United States, is significantly greater than the willingness to defend Ukraine, which some people have called for an active defense of Ukraine, but clearly the president is not going to go there, and they will aid the Ukrainians to a very large extent, but not put planes in the air and boots on the ground to fight the Russians.
So question, why Taiwan is more important than Ukraine? Is it because it makes semiconductors? Is it because of economics? Is it because it is important to contain China?
I think there's multiple reasons. Certainly, more recently, you hear more and more about the Taiwanese semiconductors and their critical role in the U.S. economy, and should that capability fall into the hands of the PRC, then that could be, extraordinarily disruptive for our own economy. So there's that. There's the military advantage that China would accrue by having. Taiwan was many decades ago referred to as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. Well, if you turned it into China's unsinkable aircraft carrier, that would allow Chinese power projection to a much greater extent than it currently has. Countries around the region, including those countries allied with the United States, would have to react accordingly.
Such as Japan and South Korea.
Yeah, exactly.
The Philippines.
The U.S. Military freedom of operation would be constrained, and so forth. It would back the United States to some degree out of the Western Pacific. So you have the military advantage. And then I think you have the longstanding ties between the United States and Taiwan, which stretch back, all the way to Chiang Kai-shek's evacuation of Taiwan in 1949, and the admiration for, a Chinese democracy now in Taiwan. And you can go back and look through American history, whether it's embedded in the Taiwan Relations Act or in statements of sentiments from presidents and members of Congress and everything else. But I think there's a real desire to avoid seeing a democracy that is built a very successful de facto kind of country for itself swallowed up by force because the big country near it decides it would like to have it.
Now, I understand the U.S. perspective of protecting Taiwan, but right now the Chinese Communist Party is going through a crisis of legitimacy. They had a social contract with their citizens, and that contract was very simple. This is the iron bowl. We will feed you. You will get economic growth in jobs. And in return, you will owe us unquestioning fealty. In fact, very much like the old imperial rulers of China. Under Xi Jinping thought is now part of the constitution. Zero COVID policy was a disaster. The credit bubble of Chinese banks is bursting. The real estate market is tanking. Up to 60% of personal savings are locked in real estate. At this point, communism of the Communist Party is practically fiction. And so they will revert to nationalism. And that means that sentiment over Taiwan, sentiment over South China Sea, they just have come out with a 10-dash line, which thankfully is less than the 1947 Kuomintang's 11-dash line. But nevertheless, the nationalism within China is the only thing giving legitimacy to Xi Jinping. And do you think that could lead to the Thucydides trap, as Professor Graham Allison talks, the clash between a ruling and rising power?
Well, I mean, I think in that sense, it wouldn't be the Thucydides trap, because by the indicators you described, China would be declining. So it would be, and I actually worry about.
But a declining China is more dangerous.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I mean, if you look historically,
he has to whip up that xenophobic sentiment.
Not only that, but declining powers, as we see in Russia today. Or if you want to go back and look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire before World War I, I mean, they just have less and less to lose. Because they're less invested in the way things are, and so they're more risk tolerant. I mean, if you're increasing in power, then you've got more and more to lose with each passing year, and you can be emboldened by your power, but you can also be chastened by the fact that things are getting better for you. So if China thinks that things are getting worse because it's somehow in decline, then yes, that could absolutely be the trigger for a more risk-tolerant approach to things, including to Taiwan, that could ultimately lead to conflict. That said, I'm not convinced China's declining. I mean, part of this is a matter of interpretation. And, you know, in Washington, it seems to have flipped from everybody worried about China's rise for years to a few months ago, everybody started worrying about China's decline overnight and pointing to exactly the same things you have. Well, look at the stock of non-performing loans, and real estate, and youth unemployment's above 25%.
Yeah, they're all going to temples.
So, you know, and some of these things are not entirely new, but, you know, this also depends on what you look at. And China's military might, which we care a lot about, is increasing in power. Their defense budget is not zero. Their growth rate is come down, but their economic growth rate is not zero, and their population is actually declining, and so their per capita income is rising.
This year, they might be in recession, though.
Might be, but so far they haven't been in negative territory. So my point is just that, yes, compared to the big economic growth rates of yesteryear, China has slowed down. Has it started contracting? No. Has its military become weaker than it was in the past? Absolutely not. Has its foreign policy become more restrained? I see no evidence of that. So in the ways that we care most about, I don't think that China is obviously declining. But, you know, you've got to look out either way. But
they're less invested in the world, with all this talk about industrial policy, CHIPS Act, promoting semiconductors here, with talk about decoupling, talk about globalization, talk about reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring. And that discourse is not only there in the US, it's there in the EU, it's there in India. So China certainly is not going to be as reliant on exports as before, which means that they will be less invested than before in their relationship with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I have a different take, which is not that those things were the drivers. I think that at the strategic level and at the level of Xi Jinping, after the global financial crisis and other big international events, which Xi Jinping believed were evidence of fundamental flaws in the West, the Chinese leadership concluded that the West Day was essentially done, that China was essentially in the ascendance, that ultimately the world was going to have to get used to a dominant Chinese role, certainly regionally and then globally, and that you could expect the United States and its Western friends and allies to try to cling to the prerogatives they used to have, which were anachronistic and not a function of the way the world should be. And so it was going to be pretty tense as the U.S. declined and China rose, but that was just the way it was going to be. And I think they still believe that.
They may believe it, but Xi Jinping hasn't shepherded the economy very well. And he is the son of a disgraced Marxist, and he's almost swung the pendulum back to Marx. Back to Mao. I apologize, I said Marx. And Mao, of course, centralized the economy, centralized power, and gave China some good things, but also the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. It was Deng Xiaoping who said it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. In fact, he gets the credit for spectacular growth rates. Under Xi, China seems to have reverted back to Maoist centralization, and the economy is not doing as it was. Now, there was no way it could have kept up the growth rates, but his policies haven't helped either.
Yeah, no, that's right. Now, I mean, he's clearly not going back to Mao in the sense that, I mean, people aren't melting down their farming implements to make, steel in the backyard.
No, not to that extent.
And China may be ultimately caught in the middle income trap as a result of policies or whatever you want to attribute it to. Certainly, some of their policies have not helped. But even very recently, the assumption was that, a graph that showed Chinese economic growth would go up and to the right indefinitely at a pretty steep pace. Maybe slow down, but it was people kept saying, well, China's not yet the world's biggest economy, but it will overtake the United States by X date, and those dates seem to kind of get closer and closer in all of this. Now you don't hear that so much.
Well,
anymore.
Glenn and I were always contrarians because never in history has any economy grown endlessly and continuously. There have always been slumps and then spurts. So we were contrarians because we thought that the economic laws of gravity would catch up.
Well, and they might be, right? I mean, and so I think then the question is, do they catch up in a way, if they are they catch up in a way that's sort of structural, that would require structural change such as that the government under Xi Jinping is either unwilling or simply unable to make those changes? Or is this sort of natural fluctuations? We're not that long out of COVID. They opened up way later than everybody else. They've got this real estate bubble, but we've had real estate bubbles. The Japanese have had those can burst and economies can move on without, going backwards tremendously. I just don't know the answer to that question. But what does seem interesting to me is that, given the economic issues that China has, you could imagine Xi Jinping going in one of two ways. One, he could go in the direction of Mao and saying, well, forget the economy. This is about nationalism and the party, and we're going to be aggressive abroad and all this other kind of stuff along the lines of what you were describing before. You become more risk tolerant, more let's rally around the flag of nationalism and the party and all this. Or he could go more in the direction of Deng Xiaoping and say, well, look, it's economy first. It's one thing to be aggressive abroad when, our economy was growing at 10%. But if we're at 2%, then, we got to focus our energies elsewhere. There's nothing I see that suggests the latter. Maybe it's to come, but I doubt it. It seems like it's not, that we need to actually focus on the economy and bide our time for some amount of time in a Deng Xiaoping sort of way, but rather, you still have this kind of expansive view of what China should be doing in the world in a rather brusque way in which it should be doing it. And I think that in turn flows from this core conviction that the leadership has that this is just the way the world is going. That yes, there may be ups and downs here, maybe 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but ultimately there's going to be a dominant position for the world in China. And ultimately, there's going to be a decline in the power of the United States and the West and a change in kind of the international order to better reflect what they believe is the accurate distribution of power and the way international legitimacy should reside. So we'll see.
We'll see. On that note, Richard, it's been lovely to have you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for making time for us. We'll see you again on FO Podcast, and we expect an article from you very soon.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All the best. Bye.